And welcome to another Wrestling Roundtable discussion podcast. I'm Adam Wilborn from WhatCulture, joined by the Dudley boys of WhatCulture, Michael Hamflett and Michael Sidgwick, to discuss big wrestling issues from this week. But before we begin, if you're a fan of this sort of thing, make sure to subscribe to WhatCulture Wrestling on either iTunes or Spotify for daily podcasts where we review pay-per-views, Raw, SmackDown, we have interviews, we have more roundtable discussions, and we have a roundup of the week complete with a bloody good quiz, of course, on wrestle culture. But gents, I must ask you a question to start.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Thought we were going to make it through the whole month.
What is next for Bray Wyatt? We saw him return at the well-known house show Starrcade, and that's all it'll ever be known as now, thanks to WWE. He returned to replace Braun Strowman in a match against Baron Corbin. So what can you see for him next? Because he needs a lot of rehabilitation from what he's had over the previous few years in WWE.
I don't necessarily think Wyndham Rotunda is irredeemable, but Bray Wyatt is irredeemable. Yeah. Like, he's just been stigmatized for me, not only as a loser, but as just a total joke of a performer. Like, the supernatural shtick has got really lame. He has lost comprehensively so many times despite possessing supernatural powers, which is just like absurd. It's not just 50-50 booking like some mid-card rank and file. This guy was meant to be the next Undertaker, and I think no matter how long he's off television, he's just been stigmatized as a total joke. A good creative team might still get something out of a character that I think a lot of the fan base still really wants to succeed, but they can't write for him. The only thing I can suggest, and I'm doing this because it would be a bit of a schadenfreude delight for yours truly, is repackaging him as Sister Abigail. And I'm not just proposing that for the banter, even though I am, because you look like your fat goth sister. But what I'm getting at is I need to be completely disassociated from the Bray Wyatt character. So to answer your question, what next for Bray Wyatt? Hopefully not a thing. But I do think there's a performer underneath that garbage gimmick.
I mean, yeah, like I can't really disagree with anything Sidgwick said. We ask what's next, but what was ever really first for Bray Wyatt? Like, the very first thing he did was that story with Kane, which immediately ties into the supernatural stuff, and then he profoundly fails to be a good supernatural character over and over and over again. Like, his first matches were bad, his first programs were bad, he didn't ever really recover. The only opportunities he got to recover were against the likes of The Undertaker and Randy Orton, and he failed to make himself look like a believable and credible threat to either of them.
The booking doesn't help.
The booking
doesn't
help, but the booking serves to hamstring most of the roster, and some look worse than others. And I would argue there's been times, like I think I've even argued it on the website before, that like Bray Wyatt is like the worst kind of modern creation WWE have ever come up with, because he was a character. He was one of the first like high-profile NXT failures, a guy that completely reinvented himself away from his original main roster gimmick without having to wear a mask or anything like that. He just said, I'm going to start again, like a fresh start.
And it's to his credit.
Yeah. This is the thing. Like he thought, I'm going to have to give this a full, like, complete reboot. WWE took that, had no idea how to handle it, butchered it over and over and over again, to the point where the only guy that could really kind of resolve the character in any way was Matt Hardy. Like, Matt Hardy's Broken Universe was the best thing that had ever happened to Bray Wyatt. But even then, it sort of felt temporary, and not because Matt was looking increasingly more broken down. It was just like, yeah, even Bray Wyatt's character is such that even he can't like hang on to Matt's coattails that long. It's quite tragic to see it play out the way it has done.
And we also saw WWE immediately before they did the whole sort of ending to the Bray Wyatt Matt Hardy thing, before they joined together as a tag team, literally say to the audience, "This is a bit silly. This don't take this on board."
That's pure Vince.
Yeah.
Pure Vince. Like you said, what was the word he said? This is obnoxious. I'm sorry.
Well, and they threw him into a lake of reincarnation.
I was excited.
Which is the ideal opportunity to just get rid of this character. And they wouldn't even give him that. They wouldn't even give him Matt Hardy's like little banter gimmick for WrestleMania. He came back as Bray Wyatt, and all we were left to do was roll our eyes again.
You're the most optimistic of the three of us. Do you see any way back?
I think he's had a decent amount of time away. I'm not sure if it's quite sufficient for us to all forget and forgive the previous things. And I think that always goes with Bray Wyatt. It's just momentum. I think whether or not he comes back as a different character or as Bray Wyatt, regardless, you have to give him a lot of momentum to get him going again. I think you could easily bring him back as Bray Wyatt. I remember the pop he I mean, granted, this was sort of partially due to Roman Reigns. But when he came back, when Roman Reigns was about to win Money in the Bank, and the reaction that got, it was amazing. And I think if you are going to bring him back, aside from if we try and disregard this Starrcade appearance, like he may turn up this week on Raw or SmackDown or whatever, you need to give him a moment to come back to a reason, a justification to come back, unless you're going to reinvent him as a character. And I think if you give him that and then use that as some sort of forward momentum, he does have chances. But taking that into account, if you don't bring him back as Bray Wyatt, if you bring him back as a new character, would he work better as a face or a heel, considering the journey that he's been on?
I think it works better as a heel. My only concern with the Bray Wyatt character, which he did so well to get over by himself back in NXT, is I think it's been butchered for so long. I think he's lost any kind of grasp over what made it successful. Like his character work in NXT, a lot of which was his own creation, was really quite good. But have you read his Twitter account recently? It is cringeworthy. He's doing this gimmick now where he's a patient in a mental asylum and his doctor has assumed control of his Twitter account. And it's like, I did create wrestlers on the old SmackDown versus Raw games that were considerably goofier than this. And I was like 15, 16 years old. Like, I think he's kind of lost it. He's completely lost it. And I think if he can get something that isn't dead to sink his teeth into, I think there's a genuine creative mind there, but this gimmick is just dead.
I'm not so sure what I think of him as a creative force, because for the longest time I assumed he was just being like over-scripted into an early grave as a character. Because for me, the biggest problem with his character is his promos never made any sense. You could never tie like the daft metaphors he was kind of like coming out with on Raw to any of his actual storylines. But it turned out that like he was given quite a lot of freedom to like script a lot of his promos, which is perhaps what we see in the form of this Twitter account now and what we've seen previously. And I have worries for that. I would like to see him. I'm kind of with you on momentum to a point, because I think there's maybe an untapped singles babyface running him, if only for that one night that he teamed with Roman Reigns. I think on a post-WrestleMania Raw, there's a great gif that just shows him like pointing without looking as Roman takes out a heel with a spear. And you just think, well, as a guy that actually wins matches and a babyface, maybe there's something to get behind. But he was the WWE champion once, and nobody got behind that. So maybe that's just blind faith at this point. One last run, maybe as a babyface, but it's a Hail Mary. I don't really think it'll work in my gut, but I could see why they would want to give it one last chance.
And also trying to limit WWE in their, let's put maggots, projected onto the ring and all that we had at WrestleMania of all places.
And the House of Horrors is probably one of the worst things they've ever done for me. Like it just got that idea all wrong. It was similar to when they tried to do Matt Hardy stuff before Matt Hardy got there. It was just their overly cinematic and silly version of something that in the right context can be good. And I don't think Bray Wyatt will ever be quite presented in the right context.
Right, well, let us know your thoughts on that by tweeting us at WhatCultureWWE or letting us know your thoughts in the comments section. From one character who arguably needs salvaging in WWE to a storyline. Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins, a feud between those two has been highly anticipated since their brilliant feud back in, 2015, around then, sort of that time?
2014
post
even.
the turn, wasn't it? Post the turn.
So since then, we were anticipating the roles being reversed and this finally coming to fruition, and obviously the turn and the Shield and what have you. And yet, here we are, months and months and months away from WrestleMania, and we kind of can't wait for this feud to finish because they've really bungled this. Can WWE salvage this storyline?
They can, and I'm not being facetious at all when I say this. I would give the Raw writers a month off, and I would literally just splice in the Chronicle documentary in place of those segments, because it was really, really good. I don't know if you've seen it, but obviously it follows Dean Ambrose on the comeback trail. And it took me a while before I realised, because there's always this question mark over Dean Ambrose and whether he's, reluctant to like really bring himself forward into the role, or if he's just simply just lackadaisical, or if he doesn't know what he's doing. But he knows what he's doing. In that documentary, which he completely works, he plays the role of like a really vulnerable like guy who builds up walls like really, really well. My heart was going out for him at times. And I just think a performer of that nuance and that vulnerability is just completely incompatible with how they write television. Like, I wanted to understand this Dean Ambrose on Chronicle. I wanted to know, like, if he was happy, if he was sad. I couldn't get, like, to grips with him. And then on Raw, he's telling the crowd that the smell And it's just juvenile stuff for what really is quite a mature, like sort of a progressive, like portrayal of a man, I would say. No one is as vulnerable as he is, and I think there's something to tap into there.
They flip between two extremes here, don't they? They have the cartoonish, or what's that smell? It's LA on the one hand, and then yet on the other hand, they're sat there saying, look, what we did was part of the Shield was wrong. We were always going to get punished, and that's what's happened to Roman Reigns now, using his real life illness in a storyline that you don't need to have that hammered home every single week, do you?
I think I enjoyed the Chronicle thing as well, and I think like this isn't the first case of somebody on a WWE Network special coming across far better than they do as like a scripted character within Monday Night Raw, either if they're playing like a sort of a semi-kayfabe version of themselves, or you just seeing them walk backstage and talk to colleagues and like express their hopes and their fears and their doubts, like the real human beings that you still should be able to connect with. They do that all the time. I do wonder why there feels such a great need to like elevate those characters to an unrealistic level on television. The Roman Reigns element of this storyline is the saddest thing for me, because I was somebody that defended them using that night as the night Ambrose turned. I thought that was the exact right level of that story to use in that storyline, and then you leave it alone. You drop in Michael Cole's comment about not on this night in the video packages if you want, but that's all you really need to use as part of the storyline, and everything else is built up from years of working together and Seth's original turn. Like, it's a bit of a cliche take this, but like it really did write itself, and yet they're crafting it off something entirely different. You've got a man that you always knew was near breaking point, was turned on by his friend, and then they spent such a long amount of time bringing that friendship back together. They showed great care and attention to Ambrose's fragility in making them come together again in the first place. So why, upon splitting them, have they just been so kind of reckless in how they've had Ambrose turn and immediately just become like a cartoonish WWE villain in place of a guy that was just as fragile 12 months ago?
So how do they get this back on track?
Just splice in Chronicle.
Wrestling has got to fix this. I think the match at TLC is so important as to what more they can do with the storyline. It's not ideal to have to see sort of 2 or 3 matches for a series now that we get all the time. It kind of beats the combinations into the ground. But I would like a match at TLC that kind of reminds the audience and reminds people within WWE why they've always put such faith in the likes of Ambrose and Rollins over the years to have these storylines. Let them have a match at TLC that proves their worth as wrestlers, and then you split them apart again around Rumble season, which is a time to split characters apart. You can have one result in the elimination of another, and then just somehow keep them on separate paths to bring them back together in time for WrestleMania, because I think you can use this one match to make a second match at WrestleMania feel far more important and almost wash away like the month of television that we've seen, because I don't think certainly last week's Raw was the example of how not to do it. You can't be using these characters in 5 or 6 segments across a 3-hour show. It's too much.
Seth Rollins has said obviously he's going to have an IC title open challenge tonight on Monday Night Raw.
Yeah.
Does the Intercontinental title sort of muddy the waters a little bit here?
I don't know. They've barely paid attention to it, to be perfectly honest. The personal grudge feud, which does not resonate as a personal grudge feud because it's like cynically worked on the back of Roman Reigns' like really tragic circumstances. The Intercontinental title for me is a complete non-factor in all this. And to answer the question that Hamflet also answered, I feel like I'm beating like my head into the wall by saying this, but just harness Dean Ambrose's real life personality and turn it up to 11, which seems to work 99 times out of 100. Well, it used to in the history of pro wrestling. He had a very tough upbringing, which he can echo in this storyline with Seth Rollins, and which he's harnessed himself on the independent scene as John Moxley. Like, his promos were so like raw and naked, and that's exactly the kind of dynamic that needs to be brought to the Seth Rollins storyline. But instead, it's just really broad, stupid heel work, talking about how people smell and how he's like scared of Seth Rollins now. No, it doesn't work for me.
It's the Red Wagon babyface, like Red Wagon in a plant pot babyface that he played against Chris Jericho and Brock Lesnar, but as a heel, isn't it? It's just that same silliness.
Just they can't grasp what it is about Ambrose. What they see is lazy and unmotivated. In the wake of me watching Chronicle, I interpret it as there's something actually really quite artistic there, but I just don't think they've got the nous to tap into it.
For what it's worth, I think this Intercontinental title open challenge is an excuse for them to fill around 50 minutes maybe, with one Seth Rollins match on an episode of Raw. I think they love that Monday Night Rollins gimmick. They love him as the workhorse of the roster now. I don't think it'll necessarily feature Dean Ambrose in the match, but it'll probably feature him in the finish. Might even cost him the title or something like that. This is more just one of them Seth Rollins exhibitions where you get to see how physically impressive he is, which is another worry because really at the moment, like despite Ambrose's incredible intensity upon his return, is he not just looking a bit outmatched by Rollins? We've been told that Rollins is like the best wrestler in the company all year. Like what's Ambrose really got in his arsenal at the moment from what we've seen since his return that can even give him a good fight?
I need to see like a horrific beatdown at some point.
It does jar with that because when Ambrose came back, all we were talking about was he shaved his head, he looks hench. And he changed his moveset as well a little bit in terms of making it more just powerful as opposed to the I know he doesn't use the wacky line anymore, but. You know, that sort of thing they used to rely upon now didn't seem to have gone away. And yet now, you look at it on paper and you go, well, in a straight wrestling match, he stands no chance.
Yeah. I think TLC, as Hamflet points out, they will have a really, really, really good match. And it'll atone for a lot of the storytelling. But wouldn't it be nice if you could get both?
And you can.
I mean, you should be.
You should be allowed to ask for both.
Yeah. Exactly. Finally, I want to talk about something that's been partially discussed and sort of continues to be discussed with Becky Lynch and her fire Twitter game, I think is the best way of putting it, comparing it to the likes of, you look at Ronda Rousey, you look at Bray Wyatt, and then you look at Becky Lynch. Somebody's written an article on that recently.
Yes, check that. 10 best Becky Lynch tweets. Love writing that.
She is.
Amazing. Best intro I'll ever write as well.
And yet... there's a question out there from some fans, not to sort of get confused with the Seth Rollins-Dean Ambrose feud, whether or not she should arguably face someone like Seth Rollins, who she's been calling out. Well, she's calling everyone out on Twitter, but she's been calling Seth Rollins out. So looking at that as a bigger picture thing, do you think WWE should bring back intergender wrestling at any point in any way, shape or form? I'm
not terribly opposed because I think the best measure of how well they've done with this endlessly promoted evolution is just how much of an equal footing the men and women feel like on. And ultimately at the moment, for me, the two biggest stars in the company are Becky Lynch and Ronda Rousey. And that's not because of WWE telling me that this is a women's evolution and beating me over the head with it. It's because they're the biggest stars. So when you mentioned, I was probably being facetious when you asked me earlier on if Seth Rollins, who he should fight for the Intercontinental title. I'm saying Becky Lynch because she's my favourite wrestler at the moment. She's the biggest star. She's the person I want to go pay to watch. So for me, if you've got sort of say female wrestlers that are really struggling but could be so much more over in there against men, if you take somebody like an Asuka and you say to Vince McMahon, well, like Vince McMahon just doesn't get Asuka now that he's beaten her, and he just doesn't see her as anything other than a comedic character, but then you tell that old sexist Vince McMahon, well, she could beat a man. Book her to beat a man, book her to outperform and outkick and outwrestle a man, then if he believes her all over again, I don't really think it matters who the opponents are for the women. It would certainly favour the women more than it would favour the men until that kind of narrative is smashed, that they're not on equal footing, because I think a lot of them are. I would fancy a lot of the women to beat a lot of the men on the roster in a believable fashion. You only need to look at the Survivor Series and look at the Charlotte Ronda match to think, well, who are some of them dorks on that roster underneath those two that could take either of them in a match? You know, I could believe it. I could really believe it at this point. I could believe it, but my worry is that if you go on Twitter or the YouTube comments, that there's a certain misogyny beating at the pulse of like all of like society, that means it would just be a complete non-starter. However, if you my favourite potentially 3 minutes of all wrestling this year, in what was a phenomenal year for wrestling, I think my favourite 3 minutes, just as a complete jaw-dropping, this is amazing, I can't believe it's happening moment, was when Ronda Rousey beat the tar out of Triple H at WrestleMania. Yeah. It was outstanding. It was so good because they built so effectively the groundwork that we just wanted to see Ronda Rousey kick the hell out of Stephanie McMahon. It was a visual takeaway the entire show for me. Him cowering in the corner, a she 350. So for them to subvert that and go, right, you're going to get that, but you're going to get something you didn't know you want, and have Ronda just beat the tar out of Triple H, like that was outstanding stuff, like really pulsating, blood pumping stuff. I think if you're going to do it at all, you'd have to reserve it for that kind of special moment. And I would watch the hell out of Ronda Rousey versus various other wrestlers, but I'm not sure if intergender became the norm, whether the audience is not ready for it yet, I don't think. When we put this forward as a potential question for us to discuss today, I was thinking obviously about Ronda Rousey, about Becky Lynch, about what they could do if you just drop them into that feud. And then I thought, could this be used to launch someone on the main roster? And what I mean by that is, you look at
impactful debuts the night after WrestleMania. And it doesn't have to be that much of a jobber, but let's just say the night after WrestleMania, you have a generic male wrestler going, you know what? The night after WrestleMania is when, careers can be reinvigorated or whatever. I'm going to open challenge. I'm going to call out anyone. I'm going to prove to the guys in the back that I can really go. Out comes Shayna Baszler and chokes the life out of them. I mean, what a way to strap a rocket to her back and not necessarily continue that, not necessarily have that week in, week out that she fights male wrestlers, but what an announcement. Rather than here she is fighting Alicia Fox on her opening night on the main roster, she comes in and just destroys a male wrestler who no one really is that bothered about anyway.
I think it's
She's terrifying to me.
I think it's a short-term thing that could be really effective, but I think if you look at the long-term ramifications, look at something like Suplex City, how novel that was to see John Cena get destroyed in such a fashion, but in doing that match on that night with that layout, it's essentially ruined the next 3 years of the Brock Lesnar character because they've painted themselves into a corner. And if you reach a position where the men are on a level of the women, then there's all sorts of plot holes. Like, if you look at it as a fictional universe, can you imagine any woman, no matter how talented, going up against Brock Lesnar? I mean, it's already enough of a bit of a gaping plot hole as it is, and only the best workers like a Daniel Bryan could really circumvent that. If it's a woman who a lot of the audience will not be prepared to accept in that role, then you could be looking at an undesirable tipping point to have gone over.
I suppose you've kind of made a good point there as well. When you think about it, it is case by case. You named Ronda Rousey and Becky Lynch, and then your example case was Shayna Baszler. We're talking with people either through kayfabe or reality that we believe could theoretically take down a lot of the men on the roster, on the male roster, in a real fight, let alone a scripted one. So even last week, Ronda Rousey said, "Oh, Baron Corbin, you won't give me an opponent? I'll just take you then." And Baron Corbin backs down from it because that's something we completely believe.
Yeah.
But as Sidgwick says, then if you replace any of those situations with Brock Lesnar, it does make it tricky. So I think if you were to introduce it, it would have to be done almost perfectly, and it would have to be case by case. And I'm not sure that you can trust WWE with that, because if you were just throwing out matches every week, it would threaten both sides, I think, wouldn't it? It would threaten the woman getting the win and the man getting the loss if it was to be that way around.
Just to interject, my additional concern would be on the strength of so much of the Evolution pay-per-view and how good Ronda Rousey versus Charlotte Flair was and how good Asuka was in NXT. My worry is that the men would drag the women down because the women, given the right platform, are just better than the men in WWE for me at the moment. Mm-hmm. Sorry, comment section.
It just annoys me when we have intergender tag matches and then they have the rule of, once the men tag in, then the women have to get out the ring or whatever. I don't necessarily think that if they ever do any more of those matches, I'd just keep it as...
Lucha Underground experimented with it with kind of mixed success, really. But again, a lot of that was down to a lack of roster depth on the female side of things. And I think WWE have that, probably more than ever through NXT as well, because there's clearly as much attention paid to the women in the Performance Center as there are the men. And then you have examples like Evolution, where that pay-per-view was crafted for me as the best pay-per-view of the year. It was such thought and effort was put into it. But Sidgwick's probably onto something, about their undercurrent. It maybe wouldn't show itself immediately, but the undercurrent in the audience that could make life difficult for everyone, especially the women, for daring to be allowed the same platform as the men. We're in a position where the main event of WrestleMania stands a good chance of being Becky Lynch and Ronda Rousey, but this is probably not in the way where we thought it would happen. We probably all assumed it would be WWE forcing it on people, whereas this is a match that feels like it warrants the place. I wonder if on that night, how many fans are still going to be up in arms that women are daring to take a spot that has been for 34 years owned by men. I wonder that, as in I genuinely don't know how that will be taken.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure it's going to spark a lot of discussion. Let us know your thoughts on all these topics by tweeting us at WhatCultureWWE on Twitter, or let us know your thoughts in the comment section. Whilst you're on Twitter, you can follow all three of us. You can follow Michael Sidgwick at
Sidgwick.
You can follow Michael Hamflett at
Michael Hamflett.
You can follow me at Adam Wilborn. As I said, you can follow us all at WhatCultureWWE. Make sure you subscribe to What Culture Wrestling on either iTunes or Spotify for daily podcasts. My thanks to the Dadley Boys. Thanks to you for either watching or listening, and we will see you soon.